What did you make of that, Jordan, to be suddenly appearing on Meghan Markle's podcast as a villain?
The first
who was
thing I make
calling
of
women
it
crazy
is that she. Yeah, well, the first thing I make of it is that her voice drips with the same falsehood that the voice of Kamala Harris drips with. It's this sanctimonious, faux compassionate, talking down to her audience and trying to be sure that we're all really on the same compassionate page here, and we're all being victimized by terrible forces that are arrayed against us, and none of that's really fair. And it just grates on.
Meghan Markle does not represent black people in the United States. I don't know if you knew that.
No question she doesn't. Don't worry, I'm very familiar. Doesn't represent anybody.
Of course
other
not.
than a very elite, hypocritical group of people.
The 60 Minutes interview was a great chance to hear Harry and Meghan's story in case you missed their 2-hour sit-down with Oprah or their 6-part Netflix documentary.
Meg does her little phony, like, I'm so busy just doing so much wealthy stuff. I have the show, the podcast, I'm a duchess.
So busy?
What? It was so fake. I was like, oh.
Prince Harry, whose memoir just broke the Guinness record for fastest-selling nonfiction book of all time. They're now releasing a version for kids. I don't know if you know about this. It's a twist on The Princess and the Pea. It's called The Prince and the Penis, and it's...
It was supposed to be a safe moment, a familiar move. Borrow a respected voice, lift a few ideas, and let the authority do the heavy lifting from a distance. That's how these things usually work. Except this time, the authority didn't stay at a distance. Jordan Peterson didn't appear as a clipped quote or a convenient soundbite. He showed up in person, calm, direct, fully aware of what his words were being used to support. That alone changed the entire dynamic. What was meant to feel like borrowed credibility suddenly became a live confrontation. Not a shouting match, not a feud, something far more uncomfortable. A quiet refusal to play along. Meghan wasn't facing outrage or hostility. She was facing disagreement measured precise and impossible to dismiss as bad faith. For someone used to framing criticism as cruelty, that was the miscalculation. Because when the pushback came, there was nowhere to redirect it. No easy villain. No dramatic exit. Just a simple dismantling of the narrative delivered without emotion. And that's what made it land. This wasn't a one-off media moment. It was a crack, one that exposed something people had been reacting to for years, even if they hadn't fully named it yet. Comedians had felt it, critics had circled it, audiences had sensed it drifting off screen. The live TV moment didn't create the backlash, it confirmed a pattern that was already there. But this didn't start on live television. The move itself wasn't complicated. Meghan Markle leaned on a familiar cultural idea that women who challenge expectations are often dismissed as crazy, irrational, or unstable. It's a framing that carries emotional weight, especially when paired with authority. And that's where the calculation came in. By referencing ideas associated with Jordan Peterson, the argument gained instant gravity. His reputation wasn't just supportive, it was supposed to act as armor. The assumption was simple: if the language sounded academic enough, the conclusion wouldn't be questioned. Borrow the credibility, keep the distance, and let the audience fill in the rest. But Peterson didn't stay abstract. He didn't let his work be used as a shield. When he addressed it directly, he didn't raise his voice or posture as an enemy. He did something far more disruptive. He rejected the framing outright and labeled it dishonest. Not offensive, not controversial, dishonest. That word mattered because Peterson's response wasn't about defending men or attacking women. It was about patterns. His core argument was clinical manufactured victimhood may work in the short term, but it breaks down over time. People sense when emotional framing replaces substance. And when that happens, sympathy turns into skepticism. What made the moment sting wasn't the disagreement, it was the tone. No sarcasm, no outrage, just careful language and steady logic. There was nothing to clip, nothing to twist, nothing to reframe as cruelty. The dismantling happened quietly, which made it harder to escape. And long before this exchange ever happened, others had already noticed something felt off, especially in places where exaggeration usually lives. And years before, this satire had already spotted the cracks. Satire usually survives by exaggeration. It takes reality, stretches it, and lets the absurdity do the work. But with Meghan Markle, something strange happened. Spitting image didn't need to stretch much at all. The jokes landed not because they were extreme, but because they felt eerily accurate. The focus wasn't cruelty, it was performative depth. Ordinary moments were elevated into something sacred. Opening a bag of snacks became a ritual. Placing flowers on random objects turned into a lesson about love and intention. Breathing was framed like a breakthrough. The humor came from how little satire was required to expose the act. When basic everyday behavior is sold as enlightenment, the line between parody and documentation disappears. That's why the skits felt uncomfortable instead of silly. Viewers weren't laughing at a cartoon version of Meghan. They were recognizing something they had already seen, the aesthetic of meaning without the substance behind it. The jokes didn't invent a character. They reflected one back to the audience, stripped of the soft lighting and inspirational music. Then, without much explanation, episodes vanished. Clips were pulled. Footage quietly disappeared from platforms. No announcements, no public defense. And that silence did more damage than any punchline ever could. Censorship always carries an unintended side effect. It tells people there's something worth seeing. Curiosity spiked. The clips spread anyway, faster than before. At that point, satire stopped being comedy. It became exposure. When a joke feels too real, it stops feeling safe. And once that line is crossed, the tone inevitably changes. Once that line was crossed, the jokes stopped being gentle. Something shifted when the jokes left the fringe and entered the room. Award shows are usually careful. Punchlines are tested, targets are protected. But when Meghan Markle and Prince Harry became the subject, the usual safety net wasn't there. The jokes landed and nothing followed. No groans, no awkward defenses, no collective attempt to soften the blow. Just silence. That silence mattered more than the laughter. Because when late-night hosts and award presenters started pointing at the same thing, the pattern became undeniable. Millions poured in from Netflix, yet even insiders struggled to explain what came back out. The money itself became the punchline, not as jealousy, but as confusion. A massive deal with no clear output turns prestige into parody very quickly. Then an old clip resurfaced, and it hit harder than any joke. The Disney premiere moment. A prince, once representing centuries of power, awkwardly pitching his wife for voiceover work to executives at Disney. No satire needed. The downgrade spoke for itself. Kingdoms used to trade land through marriage. Now the currency was favors and introductions. That contrast was brutal. What made all of this sting wasn't mockery. It was the lack of resistance. No powerful allies stepped in. No influential voices shut it down. In rooms where reputations are usually protected, nobody reached for the shield. The industry simply watched it happen. And when Hollywood goes quiet, it's rarely accidental. Applause can be manufactured. Silence can't. That was the signal. The moment the safety net disappeared, everything that followed became fair game. But the real damage came when the victim story entered the spotlight. By the time Hollywood joined in, the tone had changed completely. Award shows are built on caution. Writers know where the invisible lines are, and most jokes come with an unspoken understanding that someone powerful will step in if things go too far. But when the punchlines landed this time, nothing happened. No groans, no quick pivots, no backstage walkbacks the next day. The jokes just sat there unanswered. That's when the money became the joke. Millions from Netflix endlessly referenced, endlessly questioned. Not out of envy, but disbelief. People weren't asking why they got paid. They were asking what they actually delivered. In Hollywood, that question is deadly. Deals are forgiven. Empty output isn't. Once the numbers stop making sense, prestige turns into punchline overnight. Then an old clip resurfaced and reframed everything. The Disney premiere moment. A prince once positioned above networking entirely awkwardly pitching his wife for voiceover work to executives at Disney. No satire required. The status drop was self-evident. Power that once moved institutions now chased favors in hallways. That contrast lingered longer than any joke ever could. But the most revealing part wasn't what was said, it was what wasn't. No one in the room rushed to defend them. No influential voices reframed it as unfair. In an industry famous for closing ranks, the ranks stayed open. That absence spoke volumes. Applause can be manufactured. Damage control can be scripted. Silence can't. When Hollywood stops protecting you, it's rarely about one joke. It's about momentum shifting. And once that protection disappears, every story starts landing differently. But the real damage came when the victim story entered the spotlight. The emotional centerpiece was always meant to be the interview. Sitting across from Oprah Winfrey, Meghan, and Harry positioned their story as revelation pain finally spoken, truth finally heard. For a moment, it worked. Sympathy poured in. Headlines followed the framing exactly as intended. But then comedians did what journalists wouldn't. They replayed it without reverence. That's when the wobble started. Chris Rock didn't attack the emotions. He questioned the logic. One simple question cut through the entire presentation. How do you marry into a centuries-old monarchy and claim you had no idea what it was? No research, no context, no understanding of history. The idea collapsed under its own weight. Shock only works when it's believable. Once that door opened, other parts of the story shifted too. Conversations about genetics, something families across cultures discuss openly, were reframed as malice. Curiosity was recast as cruelty. And comedians pointed out how that reframing worked. Intent was assumed, not proven. Normal questions were turned into evidence. That's when sympathy started draining away. Because people are willing to support victims. They're far less willing to support narratives that feel engineered. The moment audiences sensed that emotion was being guided instead of shared, trust cracked. Not loudly, quietly. Viewers didn't get angry. They got skeptical. And skepticism is deadly to a story built on feeling. Once intent is questioned, every tear looks rehearsed, every pause feels strategic, every claim invites scrutiny. The interview stopped being untouchable and started being replayed line by line, joke by joke. After that, even the smallest details became fair game. Once the emotional shield cracked, the branding underneath was suddenly exposed. What had once been presented as mindful living started looking like performance art. Pretzel bags carefully transferred from one container to another. Flower petals floating in water to signal elegance. Phrases like holding space delivered with gravity as if ordinary hospitality had unlocked some higher truth. None of it was offensive on its own, but taken together it felt staged. The problem wasn't luxury, it was framing. Everyday habits were being sold as enlightenment dressed up with soft lighting and solemn language. And once audiences became aware of the performance, it couldn't be unseen. Influencers didn't even need to exaggerate. They simply copied the behavior exactly as shown. That's what made the ridicule spread so fast. The recreations weren't cruel. They were accurate. And accuracy turned the brand into a meme almost overnight. Short clips exploded across social media. People pouring flower water. People narrating basic chores like sacred rituals. People whispering affirmations over snacks. The laughter wasn't mean-spirited. It was disbelief. Viewers weren't rejecting the message. They were rejecting the mismatch between presentation and substance. This is exactly what Jordan Peterson had warned about earlier. When style replaces meaning, trust erodes quietly. People may play along for a while, but eventually they sense when emotion is being manufactured rather than earned. Once that realization sets in, the performance collapses under its own weight. The lifestyle brand didn't fail because critics attacked it. It failed because repetition exposed how little was actually there. The more it tried to signal depth, the flatter it appeared. And when a brand becomes self-parody, recovery becomes nearly impossible. Then someone stepped forward who wasn't joking. Up to this point, everything could still be dismissed as opinion comedy or media framing. Then, Piers Morgan stopped speaking in generalities and went on record with something far harder to wave away a timeline. Not impressions, not vibes, events. He described how the connection began privately through direct messages. Friendly, warm, flattering. The attention wasn't sporadic, it was consistent. Public replies, private messages, early access to episodes, constant engagement. This wasn't a sleuthy encounter that drifted into relevance. It was actively maintained. Effort was applied. Time was invested. The relationship stayed warm by design. Then came the in-person meeting, a casual pub in London. Drinks, conversation, easy chemistry. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of interaction that solidifies a real-world friendship. And that's where the timeline matters, because what happened next wasn't gradual. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't a slow fade. It was instant. That same night, Meghan attended a party where she met Prince Harry. The following day, they had dinner together. And from that moment on, the messages stopped. No explanation. No cooling off period. Just silence. Complete erasure. One relationship ended the second a more powerful one appeared. That's when the pattern snapped into focus. Use, replace, erase. Morgan wasn't theorizing about motives. He wasn't interpreting tone. He was recounting what happened to him directly. The behavior didn't require decoding. It was observable. And once it was spoken out loud, it reframed everything that came before it, the jokes, the satire, the criticism. Because when lived experience lines up perfectly with what comedians were mocking, the story stops feeling exaggerated. And suddenly, every joke clicks into place. Once the pieces were laid out side by side, the pattern stopped being abstract. It wasn't about one interview, one joke, or one critic. It was about repetition. Relationships appeared intensely served a purpose, then vanished the moment they no longer fit the trajectory. Not with conflict, with silence. People weren't pushed away loudly, they were edited out. Criticism followed the same script. Any pushback, no matter how mild, was reframed as cruelty. Disagreement became hostility. Skepticism was labeled as bad intent. That reframing wasn't accidental. It functioned as insulation. If every question is an attack, then nothing needs to be answered. Victimhood becomes a shield, not a condition, a way to shut down scrutiny before it starts. Over time, the circle grew smaller. Friends disappeared from the narrative. Collaborators faded from view. Even family members were quietly repositioned as risks rather than relationships. Each removal could be justified on its own. Together, they formed a visible trail. The same behavior repeated in different settings with different people producing the same outcome. What made this moment different was awareness. Audiences didn't need commentators to explain it anymore. They recognized it instinctively. They had watched it unfold across years, platforms, and personas. Once recognition sets in, sympathy changes shape. People stop reacting emotionally and start connecting dots. That's why the jokes stopped feeling like bullying and started feeling like diagnosis. Satire, criticism, and first-hand accounts weren't contradicting each other. They were describing the same mechanism from different angles. When patterns repeat often enough, intention becomes irrelevant. Outcome tells the story. And that's the problem. You can apologize for a moment. You can explain away a misunderstanding. But patterns don't respond to statements. They respond to change. And without change, every new appearance just reinforces what people already think they're seeing, which creates a problem no rebrand can fix. What looked like a pile-on was actually something quieter and more decisive. The mockery wasn't coordinated. There was no central villain, no single spark. It happened because people across different spaces reached the same conclusion on their own. Comedians, influencers, commentators, casual viewers. Different tones, different politics, same reaction. That kind of alignment doesn't come from persuasion. It comes from recognition. Once authenticity is questioned, everything changes. Statements stop feeling sincere. Apologies feel strategic. Even neutral actions get reinterpreted through suspicion. It's not that people become angrier, they become detached. And detachment is far more dangerous than outrage. Outrage keeps people engaged. Detachment makes them stop caring. That's what turned the internet cold. Not hatred. Fatigue. The sense that every appearance followed the same emotional beats, the same framing, the same outcomes. Viewers stopped arguing about whether something was fair or unfair and started asking a different question. Why does this always feel the same? When that question takes over, the story loses oxygen. Public sympathy didn't flip overnight. It drained slowly. Each repetition shaved off another layer of belief until there was nothing left to react to. That's why responses became muted. People didn't rush to defend or attack. They scrolled past. They made jokes, or they ignored it entirely. And once the audience moves on emotionally, it's almost impossible to pull them back. You can't manufacture interest where trust has already evaporated. You can't reignite curiosity once people feel like they've seen the ending. That's where things landed. Not in outrage, not in cancellation, in something colder and harder to reverse. And that leads to the final question.